So here is our quick overview of all the little odds and ends, bits and pieces that finish up evolution for us. And we start with the process of speciation, which is the separation of one species or one population into two distinct species. And the graph at the right shows how we can demonstrate this or kind of graphically show the process of speciation. So we can see right here the D. dentissima and the D. melanogaster have a fairly recent common ancestor. So this kind of node, this point right here where they separate, indicates that there is a common ancestor right there. And that common ancestor would have undergone the process of speciation to make now two distinct different groups. Same thing would have happened here, although that common ancestor is earlier than the one that happened between the dentissima here and the melanogaster here. So when we look at this in a big picture context, we can actually plot all of the organisms that are alive or have ever been alive on Earth in this same kind of diagram that shows all of the different speciation events that have occurred. And obviously there's so many more species that couldn't fit on this, so this is a really big overview. But for example, if we look in at the mammals, we can see that the rodents are here, and like the lemurs are right here and shrews there. So they're all fairly close to each other on the tree. That means that they have closer or more recent common ancestors, and therefore they're more similar and more closely related than, say, something like one of the rodents are to some kind of reptile that have a much more distant common ancestor. By zooming in a little bit more, we can start to delineate each of these different species. You can see that the rat and the mouse have a common ancestor that is fairly recent. That's why they're so similar. Whereas the mouse and the elephant has a common ancestor that's all the way back here. So that's a much more distant common ancestor, which is why the mouse and the elephant look so much more different than each other. But if we were to compare them to, say, a plant, clearly they still have a lot more in common than either of them do with the plant. And we can zoom in even more. For example, here is the dog family, and even closer. And the question becomes, at what point do we stop breaking these up and saying, okay, these are speciations versus these are part of a species that are kind of combined? Really, what is a species is the big question. So it's a really hard one for biologists to answer because nature doesn't really work in the way that humans want it to work, which is to say that nature didn't make discrete individual species. Instead, there's kind of a continuum where different organisms have different amounts in common, or, there you go. So organisms that are closely related, we know are closer to being the same species, but where do we draw the line and say, okay, these are definitely separate? In the past, people have looked at structural similarities, so if they look alike, they're part of the same species, or behavioral similarities, or ecological similarities, or genetic similarities. And each of them has a good reason why those definitions work. The one that we tend to use for a general bio class is that of the biological species concept, which says that what defines a species is their ability to breed together and produce viable offspring. In other words, if two organisms can reproduce, make babies, and those babies can then continue that gene pool, continue passing along the genes, then they do count as being part of the same species. If two individuals cannot mate, cannot mix their gene pools together, then they are not part of the same species. They're each their own distinct one. Of course, we're going to have issues with this, but it's the best that we have, and it leads to this idea of reproductive isolation. If two groups are reproductively isolated, that means that their gene pools do not mix, and that means that based on the biological species concept, we're going to define them as being individual or different species. So what can cause reproductive isolation? Ultimately, reproductive isolation is how we define a species. But all of these different factors down here could potentially lead to two groups not being able to reproduce together. So mechanical isolation occurs anytime two groups are physically not able to reproduce because of some kind of mechanical conflict. That is, the parts of one don't fit with the parts of the other. So the reproductive parts can't work together to make a gamete. Geographic isolation means that the two groups can't even physically approach each other. They are unable to mate because there's some kind of physical barrier, for example, a lake or a river or an ocean or mountains, etc. Behavioral isolation occurs anytime that you have two groups that can interact together, but their mating preferences are different. And you see this a lot in birds. So the mating habits of one of them, the mating rituals that one group might have, are different than the other. So even though they're physically able to reproduce, they have no interest in it because they don't recognize the mating rituals of the other group, and so they never join together and make offspring. And then finally, temporal isolation is referring to any kind of difference in time. So whether that's mating that occurs in the morning versus evening, or at different times of the year, or at different times of the cycle. For example, in a lot of animals that have periods during which they're in heat or when they're receptive to reproducing, if the opposite sex isn't having reproduction at the same time, then it doesn't work. This is also going to be the case for plants. So if we take a look at anything that that releases pollen, if other plants in the area don't have flowers that open at the same time as the pollen is released, then the pollen, which is the male gametes, are never going to form together with the flowers, which are the female gametes. And so you're never going to have new embryos formed that way either. Okay. Like I said, it's kind of a mishmash of different topics. So we're going to take a step back. And we talked about natural selection, and you need variation to have natural selection occur. If you have a population of clones, they're not going to evolve because they're all genetically identical. And that doesn't leave any room for the genes to change because to change ratios because they're all the same. So the first thing you need to do to have any kind of evolution even be a possibility is to create new genes, new, novel, completely original things that have never occurred in the past, which means mutations. And we spend a lot of time looking at gene mutations, or in other words, here's the DNA, and a single nucleotide base, maybe right here, gets switched from an A to a T or a C to a G, or it just gets straight up deleted. And so those are called your gene mutations. It's just going to affect one gene. It's not going to have huge effects necessarily depending on what the gene is. Your substitutions are your silent, your missense, and your nonsense. Remember that silent means that you have an amino acid, and the amino acid is not changed even though the nucleotide sequence is. A missense is going to lead to a different amino acid being coded for, and a nonsense is going to cause a stop codon to be produced instead of the amino acid. In the case of insertion or deletion, you are getting rid of one, and that is changing the reading frame, so all of the downstream amino acids are changed as a consequence. Okay, so those are all just in one gene. But remember that DNA is going to coil and supercoil and like super uber mega coil so that it can be wrapped up in these nice little chromosomes. So we think of DNA and it like coils and starts wiggling back and forth, and that starts going back and forth, and eventually you end up with this huge piece of information called a chromosome. If you have a chromosomal mutation occur, that means a huge piece of DNA is potentially affected. And so the way that chromosomal mutations usually occur is during either mitosis or meiosis, when all of the chromosomes line up on the metaphase plate, and just by chance, one of them breaks off and reattaches either to itself or to a different location, and you end up with either extra or missing or changed locations of giant chunks of DNA, parts of the chromosome. So these affect way more than just one gene. Usually you'll have hundreds or potentially thousands of genes that are affected. In the case of duplication, that's going to, where have we got it here, right? You start with A, B, C, D, E, F. If you duplicate a chunk of the chromosome, all of the genes that are in that chunk are now present twice. So here's your duplication example here. An inversion is going to take the same genes and just kind of switch them around. The reason that this can be problematic is because maybe there's something in this region right here that should be controlling something in this region right here and saying, hey, start making more of this protein. Well, now it's going to be telling that to a new segment of the chromosome. Translocation is going to occur anytime a chunk of one chromosome actually attaches to a completely different chromosome. And then finally, a deletion is exactly what it sounds like. Part of a chromosome gets deleted. So all of the genetic information that is part of that part of the chromosome is gone. Okay, when we talked about natural selection, we kept saying that natural selection allows populations to adapt to their environment. And it's really important that we understand that when we talk about adapting to an environment, which populations do or species do, but individuals do not. Okay? But when we're talking about the environment, we're talking about abiotic factors. That's kind of obvious, like weather and climate, like humidity, how much precipitation there tends to be, temperatures, etc. But the biotic factors are really important as well. And those are just interactions with other organisms. With abiotic factors, this tends to be a little bit more of the target, right? So the more and more a species evolves, the closer and closer it gets to that target. But in the case of biotic interactions, other living things, they're evolving too. So it's much more of a moving target. So evolution begins to happen in a way that maybe at one point one thing is beneficial, but pretty quickly the other species that you interact with have changed as well because of evolution. And so what you're aiming for or what is beneficial now changes. So some examples of factors that are biotic factors that can influence how evolution occurs one is called competition. And so you can have competition within members of your species or with other species. Typically, when members of the same species are competing together, that is for mates. It's the reason why peacocks have evolved those huge, beautiful feathers. It's not because that helps them survive in their environment, except for the fact that it helps them reproduce because females are attracted to it. You can also have competition that occurs between members of different species for resources, for space, for prey, for example. So that's going to, again, lead to an evolutionary pressure based on what the competition is doing. You can also evolve, and every time I say you in this, I'm talking about a species or a population. You can also evolve to either avoid being eaten or increase how well you can eat. So in the case of herbivores, they're going to evolve certain things that help them get more nutrients out of plants. The plants themselves are going to evolve ways to minimize how much they're eaten. And of course, none of this is happening just because they want to. It's the natural variations that is going to allow some of them to survive better. So if you're a plant with a little bit more fibrous of a leaf, then you're more likely to survive because herbivores are going to pass on you and go eat the nice, soft, squishy plants because they're easier to eat. What that does for the population of plants is makes them, on average, a little bit more fibrous, a little bit more tough. Those tougher plants survive, make seeds, the next generation's a little bit tougher, and so on and so forth. So same kind of thing we're going to see with predation is that the predators are going to evolve to be better and better at getting their prey, and the prey are going to evolve to get better and better at escaping. Why? Well, the predators that aren't good at getting their prey are not going to be able to eat. They're going to starve, they're going to die, and they will not be passing the slow genes or the whatever the gene is that helps them capture their prey better. So they don't pass those on. The result is that the population overall becomes faster or have sharper teeth, etc. So another factor to consider is that in a lot of cases, organisms are going to live directly with organisms of other species. This can lead to something called coevolution, which is where two species coevolution, there we go, where two species essentially evolve to work with each other. I always like to think of the hummingbird, which has a really, really long beak, being able to get nectar only from certain flowers that have really, really long kind of tube-like petals. And so if you were to get rid of the hummingbird population, the flowers wouldn't be able to survive anymore because nobody could pollinate for it. So a mutualistic relationship tends to lead to coevolution of two species that rely on each other. The reason is because both of them are benefiting from the relationship. You can also have symbiotic relationships. Again, that means living together. So in a parasitic relationship, you're going to have the one species that is benefiting, that's going to be the parasite, and one that is not benefiting. In fact, it's harmed. So a parasitic relationship is going to benefit the parasite, harm the host, and the hosts are going to evolve to try to avoid the parasite. The parasites become very evolved to be able to take better advantage of their host. The last type of symbiotic relationship is a commensal relationship, where one species is going to benefit, but the other one's mostly not affected. For example, the spider here, by weaving its web in the antlers, are going to be more able to move around and capture more insects, whereas the deer species, I'm not sure what that is. Anyway, it's not going to really be affected. It's not going to slow it down or anything like that. So this guy, he's just like, yeah, whatever. But this guy, he's like, woo, woo, it's good to be me. So those are symbiotic relationships. Again, those are part of the environment that causes natural selection to act in certain ways. And finally, we are going to look at the evidence of evolution, and we cannot state this enough. Evolution is a theory. And it is really tempting to say, okay, it's a theory because we haven't proven it. No, that is wrong, that is wrong, that is wrong. Evidence of evolution, we've basically proven it as much as we could. The reason it is a theory is because it is supported with evidence. It's very well established in the scientific community, but what theories do is explain why things happen. All theories explain why. So the theory of gravitation explains why two bodies pull each other towards one another, and that's why our bodies get pulled toward the center of the earth. The theory of evolution by natural selection explains how species change over time because of the process of natural selection, and we have a lot of evidence to support it, the most obvious being the fossil record. If you go back in time and look at the more ancient fossils, they are much different than modern organisms. If you look a little bit closer to modern times, they are a little bit more like modern organisms, and so on and so forth, until you end up with fossils that are essentially what we have today. So the deeper you dig into the earth, typically, the more distantly related something is, and the more different it is from modern species. More superficial or shallow areas are going to give you fossils that are much more recent, typically. The fact that evolution occurs isn't really disputed, but the fact that it occurs by natural selection is supported by the fact that organisms that are not very closely related have similarities that you could only expect from the fact that they've evolved to survive in the same types of environments. So, for example, if we take a look at the process of flight, having flight is beneficial in a lot of different environments, such as escaping predators. So birds, insects, mammals, they all have representative groups that are capable of flight. Swimming allows you to take advantage of aquatic environments rather than just relying on the land. So if you're a bird who can swim, or if you are a mammal who can swim, that gives you a new environment to take advantage of, where you can potentially move away from the predators that you've had. And what we see is that in the case of wings and in the case of fins, they look similar, but they have much different structural features. So a bat wing is essentially, because bats are mammals, they have the same arm structure as what you have. This is their upper arm, this is kind of their forearm, and this makes up the fingers of the bat. So if you were to kind of hold your hands out like that, you could see that clearly you couldn't have a bat wing because your fingers are too short. But if you were to web your fingers and they got really long, basically what a bat's wing is. Whereas a bird's wing, all of the bone is concentrated up here, and everything else, the feathers, are down below. And then an insect wing is just completely different. There's no bony structure in there at all. So way different structures, but the effect is the same in all cases, is flight is available. So this is something called analogous structures, and it shows that organisms that have the same type of evolutionary pressures or the same selective pressures can evolve the same functional features. The rest of this has to do with something called homology. And homology means sameness. And the reason that there is so much homology between different organisms is the fact that we have a common ancestor. All organisms have a single common ancestor, but the more recent that common ancestor is, the more homology to individuals or to species will have. We'll look at DNA and then different developmental patterns. So when we look at DNA, all organisms have almost identical genetic codes. So there's really no reason why the tRNA that's associated with a particular anticodon always holds the particular amino acid. It's just, it evolved that way once and it is stuck. And so even though this could easily have changed, it never really has. So the fact that we all have the same code, where certain triplet pairs make certain codons, which make certain amino acids in the proteins, that's indicative of having a common ancestor. And that also means that we can take genes from one organism and put them into another and have them be expressed, because the polymerases and the ribosomes and all of the parts that are involved in protein synthesis are the same whether you're a jellyfish or a cat. So we can take a protein from a jellyfish, take the gene for that protein, put it into a cat embryo, and when the cat embryo divides, every cell ends up with that gene in it. Eventually, when that cat becomes an adult, it will express the genes that came from the jellyfish. This is a transgenic organism, or one that has been taken genes from one organism and placed into another, and it is all possible because we share a universal genetic code. Okay, embryology refers to the study of how embryos develop. So we're looking at the development of different embryos. So if you could take a second and look at this, what do you think this is going to develop into? Is this a fish, a salamander? And it might be really surprising to find out that it's actually a rabbit. Okay, how would you know that? Well, you wouldn't necessarily, because I could take a look at this guy here, and it looks really similar to what the rabbit did. What does this end up developing into? And you'd be surprised to see, oh, he's just a baby. And finally, this guy who looks exactly the same but ends up being a tortoise. So the fact that all of these different organisms, I mean, we're looking at fish, at reptiles, at birds, which are technically reptiles, but that's okay, and mammals. In the earliest stages, the very, very first few days or weeks of life, they're indistinguishable. And that is because we have a common ancestor that laid out this blueprint of how development would occur. And it's never really changed. We've added on to it at the end. More complexity has been added. But foundationally, we still have this brain developing up here, this spinal cord going down the back, a place for the eye up towards where the brain is, gill slits. Believe it or not, we actually have gills in our embryos. So we as embryos have gills. They disappear, but because our ancestors were in water, we have them as well. And because we have similar development, that means that we develop similar structures even into adulthood. And so we're going to call these homologous structures. For example, if I take a look at a human and let's say a seal, you wouldn't expect us to be super closely related, but when we look at the bones, we have the same kind of structure with this shoulder bone piece, a single long bone, not as long in the seal, but that's okay, a set of two bones, a whole bunch of little ones, and then 5 elongated fingers. The reason that we have these structures is because we evolved from a common ancestor that had a common body plan, that had a certain developmental trajectory. And it just so happens that the seal is going to use this front arm as a fin. The human's going to use it to grasp and to write. But the bones that are there are essentially the same, maybe some fusion and changing of lengths or shapes, but overall very, very similar. And again, these are called homologous structures. They may have different purposes, but the same general structure. And what's really cool about this is that we keep structures that we don't necessarily need. For example, there's no reason for a whale to have a hip bone because it doesn't have legs, and hip bones are for the purpose of having a leg attachment point. And yet, when we look at whales, they do have a pelvis. They do have the very beginnings of a femur, which is your upper leg bone. And the reason for that is because it was present in their ancestors, and it hasn't cost them enough evolutionarily to have been deleted or completely gotten rid of. So if they still had a limb, that would not be a benefit. That would be bad for them because it would increase the drag. It would increase how much energy they have to expend on being able to swim. But hey, their bodies are smooth. They've still got that femur there. They still have that pelvis, but it's not really affecting anything. So it just kind of stays there. It's the same reason that our appendix is there. It's the same reason that we have gill slits. It's the same reason that we have wisdom teeth. They don't benefit us, but they also don't often impact us enough to make it evolutionarily worth getting rid of. Now, if something were to happen and everybody suddenly started dying of appendicitis, then the people who had the smallest appendixes or were freakishly born without one, maybe they wouldn't even know it, but the variability that exists means that there's probably individuals who have very small appendixes that make it less likely that they would get appendicitis and die, more likely that they would pass on the small appendix gene